Hello YouTube! Today we are going to be taking a look at the main differences between Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2, and I will also be including some tips for newer and returning players as well in the video. For some of you that might have played PoE 2 Early Access and are looking to try out PoE 1 for the event coming up this week, or maybe you just never got into PoE 1 and PoE 2's Early Access has given you the motivation to try out the original, whatever the case may be, I am going to cover as many of the main differences between the games as I could think of, and then, like I said, towards the end of the video, I will add some tips for new players or even returning players that might be trying out PoE 1 for the first time this week. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive right into this beautiful yet convoluted mess of a game. Alright, so the very first thing we're going to take a look at is the gem system within the two games, as they differ slightly but are essentially the same in theory. In PoE 1 and in PoE 2 we have skill gems, support gems, and aura gems, and in each game these gems perform the same way. You can link support gems to skill gems or to aura gems to buff those gems, and that is the same for both games. The difference between the games, however, is how you actually go about linking the gems to each other, as well as socketing gems in general. In PoE 2 you have lesser jeweler's orbs, greater jeweler's orbs, and perfect jeweler's orbs, which you use on the gems themselves to gain extra sockets that you can place your support gems inside of to support the main gem. In PoE 1, however, it is quite different. This is because in PoE 1, gem links are actually tied to gear and not to the gems themselves. In PoE 1, we have jeweler's orbs, fusing orbs, and chromatic orbs. They can be used on gear in the game instead of the actual gems themselves. So in PoE 1, you can actually use jeweler's orbs on pretty much any piece of gear in the game minus jewelry and belts. This will result in 1 to 6 sockets depending on the gear that it is used on. For example, two-handed weapons and body armors can have 1 to 6 sockets. You can see here these have 6 sockets in them. Helmets and boots can have helmets, boots, and gloves can have 1 to 4 sockets, and one-handed weapons and shields can have 3 sockets. However, sockets by themselves won't do much without being linked. As we can see right here, there's a link between these two sockets, and there is not here. You see there's no links here, there's no links here, but we have links between these two. So this means you actually need these links to support your gems. So this is my elemental hit here. This is my, let's just say, main attack gem here. If I put this in here, and then I put a support gem in right here, and I put this on, we're actually not, this is not supporting this right now. You can see there's nothing here, whereas if we were to put it in this helmet, for example, because they're linked together, you can see this little F in the top right there. That means that there's a support gem linked to it. If I go ahead and put this one in there, you can see it gets added. But obviously when they are not linked, there won't be anything there. So that's kind of an easy way to tell if your sockets are linked if you didn't notice the links missing from it or whatever. So you can kind of tell that pretty easily just by looking over there whenever you socket your gems in. Okay, so now the next thing that we have to look at is how do you actually link sockets together, and that is where the orb of fusing comes in. So you can see here we have the chest now. It's got 4 different sockets in it, but we have 2 of them linked, and we want to get all 4 linked like this helmet up here so that we can have another 4 link in the build. So the way you do this is you just right click an orb of fusing and you use it on the item, and it's just going to randomize the links on it. So now you can see we have no links, and that's a 3 link, 2 link, 3 link, 4 link. So sometimes it can take more than that. 4 links are pretty easy to hit. Once you get into the 5 and 6 range, it definitely can be pretty expensive and a little time consuming, but it is possible to do that. So that is how you go about actually linking your items. Alright, and then our last currency that we have to go over for gem crafting is the chromatic orb, which is going to reforge the color of sockets on an item, which you probably noticed throughout the video. Yep, items in PoE 1 have colors, so you can only socket that color of gem inside of it. As you can see, I can't put a green inside of a blue or a red, so that obviously leads to some constraints, and I will say it is also important to note before you go and link an item, determine what your next link is going to be for that. So if you have, for example, right here we have 2 greens and 2 blues, well, that means that we need to hit 2 greens and 2 blues on this, which might not seem too bad, but this is an energy shield base, which means it is going to roll blues almost every single time, with the exception of maybe 1 red or 1 green each roll. Same thing with evasion rating, so this helmet is going to roll green sockets way more often than anything else. So if you were going for a 2 blue, 2 green, you would probably want to get an evasion ES hybrid base, because that will roll your colors much easier. So like here, we can just do a little test here. Let's see if we can hit something that's not green. I mean, you can see how hard it is to hit 2 off colors on an item. That we did it right there. So sometimes you can get lucky, but other times if you're trying to do something and you have limited resources on chromatic orbs, for example, it's better to just get the right base before you actually go and link it and all that, because you don't want to burn all your currency and then you have to either change your support gem to something you didn't want to do, or you have to just save up more chromatic orbs, because it can be pretty annoying. There is another method of getting off colors on certain bases as well. So like, for example, if you're doing a evasion stacking build or an energy shield stacking build, but you need some red gems in your main links, there is a way to do that, but we'll go over that a little bit later in the tips section. However, that is all I wanted to cover in the gem section of the video, so let's move on to the next section, which is the lab and ascendancies. Alright, before we get into the whole lab thing real quick, I did just want to quickly touch on movement skills in PoE 2 and PoE 1. So in PoE 2, you basically just have blink as a movement skill, and it has a cooldown, so it's not that great at giving you movement. But in PoE 1, we actually have different movement skills. So you can see here I'm using Leap Slam, and yeah, this is an in-game character, so I mean I can just leap through the whole zone very quickly. There's no cooldown obviously, so you can see that this just greatly increases the move speed throughout the game. There's also other ones such as like Flame Dash. Alright, here's Flame Dash. So you also have Flame Dash, which just does this. You have stacks of this. This one does have a cooldown, but I mean, it is obviously way better than Blink in PoE 2 because you can get 3 stacks of it, which is super nice. And then we also have the Dash skill gem, which you can get at level 4, which is much like Flame Dash, except for it doesn't have 3 stacks. You just get 1 stack of it. I think you can also use a skill gem or a support gem to support this to give it more stacks. But Leap Slam and Whirling Blades are my 2 personal favorite move skills in the game because they don't have cooldowns and you can just blast with them. They go really quick. Although Whirling Blades is my favorite, you can only use it with daggers, claws, and one-handed swords. But I just wanted to quickly touch on movement skills because they are a massive change between PoE 1 and PoE 2. And they are amazing for just movement speed in the game in general. So now let's go ahead and get right into the lab section. Alright, so real quickly, let's just take a look at the PoE 1 Ascendancy system compared to the PoE 2 system. In PoE 2, you gain your Ascendancy through the Sekimas or the Ultimatum Trials, which are actually mechanics within PoE 1 as well. However, in PoE 1, they don't grant you your Ascendancy. In PoE 1, we have what is called the Labyrinth, which is exactly how it sounds. It is a maze-like map that you have to navigate through in order to find a boss named Azaro. Within each of the 4 labs, you need to kill Azaro 3 times, and after the final kill, you will be able to select your Ascendancy. In order to do the lab in PoE 1, you will need to complete Trials of Ascendancy that you will find as you progress through the acts. You can access the Plaza of the Labyrinth from the Act 3 town, right where I'm standing right here. A general rule of thumb for when to do your Ascendancy is right around the middle or end of Act 4, you should do your first lab, followed by the second lab around the end of Act 7, and the third lab right before killing Act 10 Katava. I know, 10 acts sounds like a lot, but in reality, you can probably get through them in half the amount of time it takes to get through the acts in PoE 2. For the 4th and final lab, I would recommend going for this when you think you're ready, as it is a level 75 area. You can sort of use this as a baseline. If you're able to do level 75 maps pretty comfortably, then you might be okay. In order to attempt this lab, you will need an item called Offering to the Goddess, which is normally pretty cheap, although it is also pretty easy to get, as you will need to, all you need to do is complete trials within maps that spawn randomly. And in my opinion, I definitely feel that the lab system in PoE 1 is superior to the current trial system within PoE 2, as it is very difficult to complete the last trial in PoE 2, where it's much more attainable in PoE 1, and there's a lot of power behind that. With that being said though, let's go ahead and move on to the next topic, which is Flasks. Alright, so real quick, let's just take a look at Flasks in PoE 1, which are pretty much what got replaced by Charms in PoE 2, although Flasks are definitely more powerful. As we can see, Flasks in this game, you have your basic life flask and your mana flask like you do in PoE 2, but you also have a bunch of other flasks. There's also unique flasks that give some pretty crazy buffs, but we're not going to get too into those here. We're just going to look at your basic flask. So you can get a flask that has 35% all elemental res up top. You can get 100% global crit chance. You can get more armor, chaos res, damage. You can get all kinds of good stuff, evasion rating, and what's nice about these flasks is that you can also craft them, so you can use transmutations, augments on them. You can't make them rare, obviously. They can only be magic unless they're unique. You can't have a rare flask. But what makes them kind of annoying is that they have durations and you have to constantly press them and keep them up. So if I put this one on here and I push 5, you can see down here you have like a little duration, and when that runs out, obviously your flask is not affecting you anymore, which is kind of the downside of flasks in this game. However, they did recently, not super recently, but they added instilling orbs and enkindling orbs, which kind of make them like charms in a way. So if I use an instilling orb on a flask, it's going to put a mod on it that this one I hit right here is used whenever I become frozen, which isn't too great. Used when you use a travel skill, shock, travel skill, and then this one. So this one right here, used when charges reach full. So you gain charges from killing monsters, and you can see that this flask consumes 20 out of 40 charges on use up top. So basically, whenever this flask reaches full, whenever I'm killing monsters, it's just going to automatically go off. So like I don't have to be pushing buttons. It's basically what we call a makeshift Mage Blood. Now, Mage Blood is this unique right here. It is very overpowered. It is probably the best unique in the game at this point. It says on the bottom left for magic utility, flasks constantly apply their flask effects to you. Now, essentially what this means is that whenever this is on, all of my 4 utility magic flasks here, because they're all magic, and then my 1 unique over here, it does say leftmost. I will say it does not have to be like this. You can definitely have it like this and it still works. But it's going to apply all of these flasks constantly to me, which basically means that I just never have to touch them and they're always active. Now, what makes this item really overpowered is when paired with an enkindling orb, for example, we can see enkindling orb gives increased charge recovery, increased duration, charge recovery again, and then up here you can see, obviously, if you do it enough, you can hit 70% increased effect. Now, the downside of enkindling orbs is that you gain no charges during the effect, which is a pretty massive downside if you're not using Mage Blood, which is why if you're not using a Mage Blood, most people will just use instilling orbs on their flasks. However, when paired with a Mage Blood, obviously you can get some pretty insane stuff. Now, this is a legacy flask right here, so Quicksilver Flask is definitely one of the most popular flasks because it gives 40% move speed up top. This one's a legacy one. It has 30% increased move speed during effect at the bottom. It only rolls, I think, up to 14% now. But yeah, I mean, so this is giving 70% move speed with 25% increased effect of that, plus the 70% up top, essentially allowing us to get 136% move speed from a single item. Well, not counting the Mage Blood, of course, because I obviously have no nodes on the tree right now. So yeah, this is basically how fast I can move without having any nodes on my tree and just having Mage Blood on, no other gear, and this flask. And then obviously Bismuth Flask, it gives all res, and when you have the increased effect on that, you can see we are capped res with literally nothing else. So you can see how broken Mage Blood is and why it is probably the most expensive item in the league, other than a mirror or potentially like Original Sin or something. There's a few other items out there that could be more expensive, but Mage Blood is definitely the chase unique that a lot of people like to go for this reason. It is very strong. So with that being said, that's pretty much all I really wanted to touch on with flasks. If you have any question about flash, just leave them in the comments, and let's go on to our next section. Alright, so the next thing that I just wanted to touch on was currency in PoE 2 and PoE 1 is somewhat the same and also very much different at the same time. So in PoE 1, we definitely have a lot of the currencies that exist in PoE 2, like the Transmute and the Augment, the Regal, the Exalt, etc. There's a few others like the Divine Orb and the Mirror, obviously. A lot of these items exist in PoE 1 that are in PoE 2. However, there are some items in PoE 1 that make crafting way different than PoE 1 or PoE 2 for that matter. And we're just going to quickly go down. So if you are crafting an item in PoE 2, essentially what you can do to it is if you have a white item, you can pretty much just transmute it, and then you can augment it, and then you can regal it, and then you can either like Chaos Orb it or, you know, just slam Exalt on it. So we'll just go ahead and hit it 3 times. And it's the same as in PoE 1 and PoE 2. You can have 6 mods on an item, and hybrids count as 1 mod, obviously. The armor and evasion rating there is a hybrid. But you can have 6 mods, 3 suffixes, 3 prefixes. Now, in PoE 2, the item's pretty much done at this point. You just vendor it or whatever. But in PoE 1, it's much different because we have Scouring Orbs. So Scouring Orbs allow you to pretty much use the same base over and over until you hit whatever you want. You can just right-click this, and you can click on the item, and it's going to remove the mods. But before we do that, I just want to quickly go over Chaos Orbs and how they are different. So in PoE 2, a Chaos Orb just essentially adds a mod and removes a mod. In PoE 1, however, Chaos Orbs actually just reforge an item. So that is something that does not exist in PoE 2. If I use this on this item, it is just going to roll random mods. So essentially you can hit stuff just by slamming chaos onto items if you want. It's just going to randomly roll mods, and you could do that if you want. But a lot of people will use scouring orbs to reset their progress so that they can target craft certain stuff. There's a lot more options for target crafting in PoE 1. If we go ahead and use a scour here, you can see, bam, it's back to a white item, and we can just recraft it again. So transmute, and then you can augment this and then regal it again, or you can even use alterations, which are basically just a chaos orb for blue items. So magic items, you can just use alterations to change the mods on them until you hit whatever you're going for. And then once you have your 2 mods that you actually want, you can either imprint, which is a deeper system we're not going to touch on in this video, and then you can regal, or you can just slam a regal on it and throw your exalts at it and see what happens. Now, I do want to touch on one more thing before we finish, or we wrap up the crafting section here, and that is the crafting bench. This is something that you are definitely going to want to be using during the axe and the early end game, as you get access to these crafts as you're going through the axe, and there is a lot of them, and essentially you can just craft mods on your gear. So it's very helpful if like you need some res during the axe, or like a little bit of life. You can come here to your crafting bench and you can just put whatever you want on it. So this is obviously a blue item and it has a suffix, so let's just go ahead and hit a prefix here, right there, and you can tick that off and you can just craft res on. Now when you're going through the axe, you're probably going to have access to these lower ones and not these higher tier ones. I think these unlock like in the later labs or something like that. I can't really remember right now, but you can just craft that on there for a small little price of 1 transmute, and you have a little bit of extra fire res. You can do this on all your gear. It's super nice. There's not many limitations to it other than you can only have 1 crafted mod on an item. So that's just one little thing I wanted to touch on before we moved on to the next section, which is the end game. So let's get into it. What is different in PoE 2 versus PoE 1's end game? Alright, so the end game in PoE 1 is very much different than the end game of PoE 2. That it's so much different that I would honestly need an entire video on that alone to explain everything. However, I will touch on the most obvious differences and try to keep it short, as this video is already much longer than anything else I've made in the past on the channel. So starting out, the end game of PoE 2 is a randomly generated map, whereas in PoE 1 it is a static map that reveals itself based on the maps you are running. In PoE 2, you get waystones, which can be placed on a map within the atlas. In PoE 1, you simply get specific maps that you place into your map device to run. This means that essentially you could run Sandspit the entire league if you wanted to in PoE 1, although that map specifically doesn't exist. There are some maps with amazing layouts that I'm sure you will find enjoyable. I should note, however, that it is important to run different maps at the start of the league, as running these maps will grant you points into the atlas tree, although it isn't going to exist in this upcoming event. But in order to gain these points, you need to meet specific requirements when completing the map. For white maps, tier 1 through 5, you just need to make sure that you complete these maps as magic items. For yellow maps, tier 6 through 10, you need to make sure you complete them as rare items to gain the atlas points. And finally, for red maps, tier 11 through 16, you need to complete these as corrupted rare items to gain the atlas points. So before we get too deep into the atlas tree, which we're not going to cover too much in on this video as it's not going to be in the event, there is something else that differs greatly from PoE 1 and PoE 2, which is portals. In PoE 1, we actually get 6 portals for every single map that we run, meaning that there is much more room for error and it is much less punishing, as you can still loot the monsters you killed when re-entering the map after dying. Another thing to touch on real quickly is the bossing in PoE 1. Bosses in PoE 1 spawn in every single map that you run, although they're much less fun to fight than the bosses in PoE 2, I can definitely admit that, and are essentially just glorified rare monsters in PoE 1 at this point. There's many more of them in PoE 1 than there are in PoE 2. In-game bossing in PoE 1 is very plentiful, and I'm sure that you will find many of the pinnacle bosses very enjoyable, and others, Cyrus, maybe not so much. Lastly, before hopping into the atlas tree, one last thing I wanted to quickly mention is divination cards, which drop in specific maps and are essentially just fragments for unique items. This means that, yes, that mage blood that we mentioned earlier is technically target farmable, although the div cards for higher end uniques are much more rare, and you might need to run like 1,000 or more maps to see a single one. It really depends on the amount of juice that you put into your maps, so Juicing just refers to the amount of money that you put into your maps, as you can apply scarabs that affect specific league mechanics that appear within your maps, and so on. Now moving on to the Atlas tree. The Atlas tree is essentially another skill tree that allows you to allocate points to it to alter the content that appears within your maps. Now this isn't too important to understand if you're playing this event coming out this week, as it will actually not exist in the event, as I mentioned earlier, and instead will be replaced by icons. However, they did state in the Q&A that this is not a permanent change and that the Atlas tree will remain in future leagues. I'll probably do a more in-depth dive into the Atlas tree in a future video after the event finishes if you guys want that. That's all I really wanted to cover in the in-game section of this video. It's getting pretty long and I need to still go over some of the tips that I have for people trying out the game for the first time. So let's go ahead and get right into that. Alright, the final section of the video, tips that I wish I knew sooner in poe1. So the first thing we're going to talk about is resetting instances. So if you find yourself stuck in like the axe and you can't get past a certain area and you just need to level, well, you can actually just go to any waypoint or any zone entrance, and if you go to the area you're at, so we'll just reset Blood Aqueducts, if you hold down control and then click it, you can just make a new instance of it, which allows you to kind of get your levels up pretty quick, and you can get back into that zone you can't complete and get her done. So the next thing we're going to look at is actually the left click button. So I think the default, it just goes like this, and the problem with this is that whenever you're in your in-game build, if you have this set, you can kind of get yourself killed sometimes because you might just be walking somewhere, and if there's a monster there that you kind of are just ignoring, well, it can focus it and just draw you towards it, which is something you definitely don't want to happen. So putting this to move only just makes it so that you won't accidentally get yourself killed that way. And then while we're on the skill panel here, another thing we have to look at is actually if you go here on attack skills, and I think maybe even bow skills, I'm not 100% sure, there's this box right here that allows you to attack without moving. So if I take this off, I'm holding down right click right now to attack. So it's not going to attack until I get near monsters. Now if I tick this on, I can just attack anywhere. And this is super nice because it's kind of the same thing as the move only default attack thing. Sometimes this can get you killed if you don't have this on, as you'll just pull yourself into packs that you don't want to be inside of and you would rather attack them from the outside. So definitely something to look out for. And with the next tip, we are going to move on to a little crafting trick that we have. Alright, so like we were talking about earlier in the gym section of the video, sometimes you will get an item base that you want to use, but it's not going to roll the colors that you need. So right here we have an armor base, which is mainly going to roll red sockets. Now, if we wanted 3 or 4 blues on this, spamming chromatics at it is probably not going to go too well. As you can see here, it's going to be pretty rare to even get like 2 blues on it. We had 2 off colors there. There's 2 blues. But let's say we need to get 3. So the best way to actually go about this, instead of just spamming chromatics until you lose your mind, is to come over to the crafting bench and use these crafts right here. So jeweler's orbs are way more just, you can get them way easier than chromatic orbs. So essentially what you can do here is you can just 2 sockets, and then you can do 2 blue sockets here to guarantee that you have 2 blues. You could even start with 3 if you wanted, if you're doing it on a body armor or something, but for this example we're just using gloves, so there's only 4 sockets. And then what you can do is you can actually go 3 sockets, and it's always going to keep your first 2, and then if you go back to 2, it's always going to keep those. So you can essentially just do this back and forth until you get your blue socket, and then you can do the same thing for the 4th socket if you need 4 blues, but it's kind of like a cheap way to just go about coloring something that isn't really going to hit blues very often while retaining the blues that you already have on the item. So very helpful tip that can save you a lot of money in the long run. Alright, and then for the last little tip here, if you just finished the axe or you just got to the end game, the first thing you definitely want to do is go ahead and go to your chat menu and type /passives, and it is going to pull up this list here that is going to show you all of the quests that reward skill points. I'm not sure why they don't have this in PoE2 yet. I'm sure they will add it sometime in the future. But essentially, if you see all 1s and 2s here, then you are good. You got all of your points and you're good to go. There is one exception here. Deal with the bandits up here. This could have a 0, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you missed the points. It just means that you took a different reward from that quest, because this quest actually can reward skill points, or it can reward other things instead of skill points. So just go through and make sure that you got them all. And for the last little tip of advice, use your crafting bench in the axe. It'll help you a lot just to get through all of the little downsides you might run into or the tough areas you might run into. And yeah, man, just have a great time in the league. I hope you guys enjoy it. If you haven't played PoE 1 before, it really is an amazing game. PoE 2 is as well. I just don't think that it has the development time behind it yet that PoE 1 has, obviously. So it's definitely got a lot of improvements that be made. But PoE 1, it's pretty polished at this point, and it's really a great time. So have fun out there, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks.